Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 240. We are continuing our class vote unit on the death penalty, and this is going to be our last session on that topic. So this time around, we're going to look at the topic of deterrence and how arguments about deterrence are related to the question of the death penalty. So we're going to be looking at two essays from our Living Ethics textbook, one by Ernst van den Haag and another by Jeffrey Reiman. So let's get to it. So van den Haag has a really interesting defense of the death penalty. So he says that considerations of deterrence can be used to justify the death penalty, even if we lack evidence that it does a good job at preventing crime. So even if it is the case that murder still happens a lot, even when we're executing murderers, we might still have a good reason to issue the death penalty to certain criminals. And he is skeptical that statistics about the death penalty could provide evidence one way or the other. You might think about it this way, is that, somebody might point out, claiming that the death penalty doesn't work because, Canada doesn't have the death penalty, and they have far fewer murders than the United States does, a country that does use the death penalty. Well, I think that at that point, Ryman would point out that it's not quite that simple, because, there might be a bunch of other confounding factors in the mix that might explain why murder happens more frequently. So it's a super complicated question for social science to figure out whether or not the death penalty is, in fact, decreasing the number of murders. But van den Haag points out that all we need reason to believe isn't that the death penalty is doing a great job of preventing murder. He just says we need just enough evidence to believe that the death penalty will yield more deterrence than any lesser penalty would. He also points out that the death penalty is about giving murderers what they deserve, but the most important thing that he's going to focus on in this argument is just that it yields enough deterrence to justify it. So here's how he thinks about it. He thinks that in terms of costs and benefits, the death penalty leads to a net gain as long as it deters some future murders. So if it prevents even one murder, that's a net gain. If we were to impose the death penalty with no deterrent effect, then that would be a net loss, because it takes a lot of work and also mental anguish on the part of the state to impose it. But we are better off if we can prevent at least one murder. And then he's going to argue that we actually do have reason to expect more deterrence from the death penalty than from revocable practices. Revocable practices being things like life in prison instead of the death penalty. So here's the thought that van den Haag has. It's that the more fearful a penalty is, the greater its deterrent effect, right? If it's more fearful to have a $100 parking ticket than a $50 parking ticket, the $100 parking ticket is going to have more deterrent effect, right? And then by the same reasoning, if the death penalty is more fearful than life in prison, then the death penalty will have more deterrent effect than life in prison. So yeah, death is supposed to be the most feared punishment, so we have reason to think that it's a more effective deterrent than any other punishment. So, there's uncertainty when it comes to the death penalty, and it's about how much deterrence exactly we're going to get from issuing the death penalty, right? That's inescapable. Social causation is too hard to understand. But he points out that we're bound to risk lives in either case, whether we choose to implement the death penalty or not. Here's how he puts it. He says, "We have no right to risk additional future victims of murder for the sake of sparing convicted murderers. On the contrary, our moral obligation is to risk the possible ineffectiveness of execution." So, we have to risk something certain for something uncertain. So what he's saying here is, if you administer the death penalty, you can be certain that the convicted murderer is going to die. And what's uncertain is whether you can save the life of a potential victim. So within that context, if we're going to risk somebody's life, we should risk, or we should be, let me put it this way. When we choose the death penalty, we're certain that the murderer is going to die, but we will be uncertain about how many victims we will save, right? If we abolish the death penalty, we will save the life of the convicted murderer, but we're going to put potential victims at risk, given that according to Vanden Haag, the death penalty has a plausible deterrent effect. So, that's the basic argument. You might raise some questions about this argument. One is, going back to some of the questions that we looked at last week about whether there are certain inalienable rights. A murderer's life being among one of those things that they have a right to, no matter how badly they've acted. We might also start to consider Kantian considerations. If what we're doing is putting a murderer to death to scare other murderers from committing the same crime, we might wonder if there's a Kantian argument that might be made there, saying that it would be wrong to use that convicted murderer as a means to the end of preventing future murders. With those sorts of puzzlements we can set aside, now we can look at Rymans' argument against Vanden Haag. And what's kind of interesting about Rymans' argument is he actually agrees with a lot of proponents of the death penalty that murderers deserve to die. If you rob somebody of their right to life, you no longer deserve to continue living yourself. But this is interesting. He says that even though murderers deserve to die, executing murderers is still the wrong thing to do. And this also picks up on some of the stuff that Nathanson said as well. He says that by sparing the life of a murderer, we communicate something. And it's that we communicate the valuable and inalienable nature of a human life. So in that way, we communicate the horror that we feel at allowing one person complete control over another and to take their lives. So when we communicate these messages about the great value of human life, the disvalue of pain and horror at allowing complete control over another, Reiman suggests that actually that might send a message that would contribute to a more civilized, less violent society that's more respectful of human life. And in this way, banning capital punishment might decrease the number of murders. So in that way, it might actually have a deterrent effect. So now what Reiman is going to do is sort of push this point as far as he can, because remember, Van den Haag said that as long as we can be convinced that we can save even one life by administering the death penalty, as long as we can save one life through deterrence, then that will be enough reason to put the murderer's life on the line to save the life of an innocent person. So here are Rymans' objections. And his objections are basically going to be that mainly, not completely, but mainly, that we shouldn't actually believe that the death penalty has a deterrent effect. So Reiman points out first that a less fearful punishment may be fearful enough to deter all who can be deterred. So he says that we can infer that just because a penalty is more feared, that it will deter more people than the less feared punishment, unless we know that the less feared penalty is like not fearful enough to deter everyone who can be deterred. So it might be that by the time you get to life in prison, you're going to deter all of the deterrables, as it were. You know, there are some people who won't commit murder even if it were completely legal, right? And then like some would drop out if it were a $50 fine, and some would drop out if it were a year in prison, and some at 10, and some at 20, and some at different points. But Reiman suggests that it might be the case, and he's just saying it might be the case, that you would get everybody who could ever be deterred once you go up to life in prison. Here's objection 2. He says that people assess risk in a very crude fashion. So even if people do fear death more than anything else, that in and of itself may not deter them. So here's how he puts it. Consider the fact, like, how many guns are owned in the United States. Like, there are more guns owned in this country than there are houses owned in this country. Anybody considering committing a crime is basically already facing up to a substantial risk of winding up dead along the way. Moreover, like, only a small percentage of murderers are actually given the capital punishment. But if these risks of death that are already there aren't deterring them, why would an additional risk of capital punishment do so? Reiman says, not necessarily the case. All right, building up just a couple more objections, and then we're going to wrap up for the day. So objection 3 says, refraining from executing murderers sends a civilizing message. So this was the point before. So this civilizing message that we abhor killing other people and refuse to do it might balance out that deterrent effect and might even lead to a kinder, more civilized society. Now, here's an objection that doesn't rest on the point that maybe the death penalty isn't actually deterrent enough. Now Reiman is going to say, what if the death penalty actually does have a deterrent effect? And the more of a deterrent effect that we can get, that's enough reason to use it if it can save the lives of some innocent people. Well, Reiman says against this that by this logic, what's even worse than being put to death, say by lethal injection, is being tortured to death. If being put to death slowly on the rack is even more fearful than the death penalty as we currently practice it, then that would save more lives, right? More fearful, more deterrent can save innocent lives. So the way that Reiman puts it is that either we should torture murderers to death or recognize that Van den Haag's justification for the death penalty on the basis of a small chance of deterrence is a faulty justification. To put things into context and to wrap things up, what we might be seeing here is just the thought that questions about deterrence in the context of the death penalty are important to think about. On the one hand, it might be the case that we can justify certain punishments and violations of a person's right to life on the grounds of preventing innocent people from also suffering at the hands of criminals. On the other hand, and this comes into some of Rymans' justifications for his criticisms of Van den Haag, we can't be certain that just because the death penalty is fearful, that it's going to prevent more murders. And moreover, just because something can prevent more murders means that it's justified to do. If we think that torture is a grievous human rights violation, we might think at least that what we can do on the grounds of deterrence might be somewhat limited. So I hope that adds even a little more complexity into this discussion of the death penalty that we've been having so far. Don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions coming up about your term paper or about the final exam, which will be released next week. So thanks for listening in, as always. Be well and take care. All right, bye.